Hello, crypto world. Welcome to the Chart Historian. My name is Justin, and on this channel, I delve deep into crypto charts, exploring chart structures, fractals, and patterns. So today, I am going to do something new. I am going to cover the HBAR chart, or Hedera Hashgraph. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is because I believe that the HBAR chart is actually a repetitive structure, and furthermore, I believe that there is a good chance in the future, there's going to be a new bull run. Let me build my case that this chart is a repetitive structure. Now, I'm going to focus on the macro structure. And by the way, folks, I am not being paid by anyone to do this. I am not sponsored by anyone. I'm doing this out of my own volition because I truly, honestly believe that HBAR has potential to do quite well. Now, full disclosure, I don't own any HBAR, at least not yet. So let's get started. So I would like to make the case that this here is actually a bull run. So now the question is, has this structure, I'm talking about this whole structure here, has this actually played out before? Well, I believe it has. Let me show you where I believe it's taken place. So I believe that this structure has played out 3 times on this chart already. Let's dive into this structure and examine the characteristics or the repetitive ideas that play out on this bull run structure. Now, to do that, I am going to break this up into different parts so you can get a good understanding of how things are repeating. Okay, so I am starting at the very first bull run that took place, and this is way back in February of 2020. So I've divided this bull run into 5 different parts, or 5 different fractals, if you will. The first one starts with a move up and then it consolidates. So after that consolidation, it moves back up and goes to a peak, or comes to a peak, at which point it winds its way down to a point before moving back up again, eventually coming to a peak in fractal 3, and then it sharply declines. And from this point on, it does a series of bounces. So fractal 4 is essentially one bounce. Fractal 5 is the final bounce before it ends this structure. So now that we have a basic idea of what this structure entails, this is the first time this structure has played out in February. It started in February 2020, and it ended roughly in March 2020. So let's look at the next time this structure plays out. Okay, so here we are in 2020. So this is May 2020, and it goes all the way to September 2020. Now, when a fractal repeats, the timing, the height, and depth, they're always going to be unique. They're going to be original. So it can make a structure look novel. So even though the main idea is playing out, the main structural concept is playing out again, the way it's defined or expressed is going to be unique every single time. And that's because timing, height, and depth are always going to be original every single time it plays out. So in this first one, so we have fractal 1 right here, where it moves up and does that consolidation. Okay, so here we are back at the original one. And by the way, folks, when this original structure is the prototype, it's the first of its kind. Essentially, every bull run that takes place after this original one right here is a copy of this. So this is the original masterpiece, if you will, and all the other ones are renditions, expressions of this greater structure right here. So as you can see, price moves up in fractal 1 and it consolidates, and we see that happen again, although it looks and it's expressed differently this time. It moves up, it consolidates. It finally moves up again, and this time it's just a pathetic, anemic move up here on fractal 2. It moves up and then winds its way down to a point before again moving back up, just like it did in the original structure where it moved up. This one was much more elegant. It moved up much higher and worked its way down. We even have the bounces right here as it moves down, just like we have in this one. This one is much more sideways and range bound compared to the first one, but we do have the bounces as it goes to that point before moving back up into fractal 3. Let's look at fractal 3. So fractal 3, price moves up, comes to a point before moving down more dramatically, just like we see in the original structure. Price moved up, comes to a point before moving down dramatically. The first fractal had much more height and depth to it than the second time it played out over here. It's much more, like I said, sideways and range bound. However, it does do what it should do. It moves up to a point, comes down more dramatically. We have bounce number fractal number 4, which is a bounce, and then fractal number 5, which is also a bounce, the final bounce. Let's go back to the original over here, and as we can see that we see the same thing. This one was much more dramatic. It moves up much higher, much more vertical movement, and then it does that bounce, and then finally in fractal 5, it does a bounce there as well. So we see this basic idea repeated here once again. Let's move forward to the latest bull run that took place and examine it and compare it to the original structure. Okay, so this is the latest structure of this type, this bull run that took place on the HBAR chart. And this took place starting in January 2021, and it went all the way to May 2022. So as you can see in fractal 1, let's zoom in on this. It moves up. And again, every single time this plays out, it's a unique expression of it, although the basic concept is being repeated. So it moves up and does a consolidation. This time the consolidation is a little different from the first time it took place, although there is a lot of similarities. It does this little dip right here, moves back up, and then kind of comes to its final ending part of the consolidation, just like over here, it does this dip before moving up and then coming down to the final ending of this consolidation, after which it moves up to a peak. Now, in this structure, we get a lot more vertical movement. So it comes to a peak and eventually winds its way down to a point before moving back up into fractal 3. Let's examine it against the original. So here, once again, it moves up and winds its way down to a point before moving back up into fractal 3. So let's examine fractal 3 on the latest one. Okay, so here we are in fractal 3. As you can see, price moves up. Now there is some deviation here. We have this little deviation that actually brings it to a peak. So you can say that this is the peak, or you might want to say that this is technically where the peak should have been. But let's compare it to fractal 3 on the original one. So here we have, it comes to a peak and then it drops. On the latest one, it does the peak here and then it kind of continues to move up, but it drops. So if you ignore this thing right here, it still does the same basic move up to a point and then drop fairly quickly, just like it did here. It moved up to a point and then dropped fairly quickly. After which it moves into fractal 4. Fractal 4 is essentially a bounce, and then the final bounce that ends this overall structure. And as we compare it to the original one, here's the fractal 4 that happened the first time, and then the final bounce, fractal 5, that ends the overall structure. So it is my belief that this structure has played out 3 times on the HBAR chart so far. I believe that this structure will play out once again. If it's going to happen again, we should also look at the times in between these structures and examine if there is a repetitive structure there as well. If we can show that there is a repetitive structure going on in the times between these bull runs, we can get an idea of where we might be in the map or the overall journey to the next bull run. So let's do that. So this is a bird's eye view of the entire HBAR chart. So here we have the first bull run, here we have the second bull run, and here we have the third bull run. So what we are going to do now is examine these times that exist in between these structures, and we're going to see if there is a repetitive sequence also taking place within these times in between the bull runs. So we're going to start here and we're going to move forward in time. Okay, so starting at the very beginning of the chart, this starts at September 2019. Now, there is this decline that is most likely a remnant of fractal 5 of the, or what would have been fractal 5 of the bull run structure. There's not much data here, so I can't get too much into this, but I can focus on this part right here. So I divide this sideways range-bound time that exists in between the bull runs into 4 different fractals. And we're going to examine the characteristics of each of these structures, and we'll compare this original occurrence of these structures to the structures that come after. So this is the first occurrence of it, which makes it the original kind of idea from which point anything moving forward becomes a rendition of this concept right here. Now, remember, timing, height, and depth is also going to apply to this. It's going to be original every single time it plays out. So it begins with a move up, and fractal 1 is essentially a bridge bringing price from the bull run structure to this sideways range-bound time. There's some basic rough characteristics of fractal 1. It has 3 main bounces. Let me tell you something about HBAR. HBAR is a sloppy chart. You know, there are some charts that are really pristine, crisp, easy to read. HBAR is not like that. It's sloppy. But it is still legible, and I do believe there is a pattern at play here, even in this sideways range-bound time. So fractal 1 has 3 basic bounces, after which it moves into fractal 2. Okay, so I zoomed into fractal 2 here. So fractal 2, the essence of fractal 2, it has these 2 bounces right here. In this one, it's quite nice and even. On some of them, it's sloppier, like you'll have it jaggy and just one big bounce and a tiny little one. So this is the essence of fractal 2, 2 bounces. Fractal 3, the basic idea of it, it moves up, comes to a point, it drops, and goes sideways before moving into fractal 4. So in fractal 4, the main idea is it has these 2 peaks right here, or these 2 waves, wave 1 and wave 2, before going into the bull run structure. So this would be part 1, or fractal 1 of the bull run structure, where it consolidates before moving back up. So that is the essence of this sideways range-bound time. It's 4 structures, and you saw the different characteristics of each of those structures. Let's move on to the next occurrence of this sideways range-bound time and compare it back to this original structure. Okay, so that brings us over here. Let's zoom in. Okay, so here is fractal 1, the second time it plays out. And as you can see, here is the tail end of fractal 5 of the bull run structure. It comes down. So in fractal 1, price moves back up again. Here we have one clearly defined bounce. This second one is just kind of flat, whereas once again on the third one you see it. So this is what I'm talking about, the sloppy kind of nature of HBAR. Let's compare this structure to the original. Okay, so here we are back at the original, and you can see how it has those 3 bounces better defined on the original one. The original one, the middle one, got more airtime. Now remember, height, timing, and depth are always going to be original. So where this one moved up higher, the second time it played out, it didn't move up. I just went flat. Like, you could say that maybe that little move up is it, but nah, it just kind of went flat. So in fractal 2, we see it move. Let's zoom in here so you can get a better idea. So you see, if you ignore all these jagged peaks, the basic concept of fractal 2 is it moves up, comes to a peak, moves back down, and you get one bounce here, and then it moves up again and does another small bounce. Let's compare this back to the original structure. Okay, so back at the original structure, let's zoom in. You see the two bounces, bounce one, bounce two. This is much cleaner, easier to see, whereas when this took place, it was much sloppier. And by the way, this structure, the sideways range-bound time, took place from March 2020 to May 2020. So let's move on to fractal 3 of this structure. So here we see it goes flat, and then it moves up and does the peak, and then it drops and goes flat again before moving into fractal 4. Let's go back to the original and look at fractal 3. So here is fractal 3. In the original, it moves up much sooner, it drops and goes flat. So again, even though the appearance is different, the timing, the height, and depth is all original, the basic idea of the structure, which is it moves up to a peak, drops, and goes flat, is playing out over here, albeit in an original rendition of that idea. So in fractal 4, we see those two main characteristics. Let me move this a little bit over. It's probably better like that. So in fractal 4, you see it move up, does one peak right here, and then the second one right here. Let's compare that to the original one. So we see the two peaks or waves, wave 1, peak 1, wave 2, peak 2, before moving into the first fractal of the bull run structure. So we see that here it is more kind of flat and sideways compared to the original one, but the same basic idea is being repeated once again. So that makes up this time that this played out. The next time this plays out is over here, and this takes place from September 2020 all the way to January 2021. Let's zoom in and get a closer look. Okay, so here is fractal 1. First thing to notice, look how tiny it is compared to the original one. Much bigger. And this is normal with structures that play out. The timing, the height, and depth are all going to be original. So this one took much longer to play out, where this one was tiny and played out pretty quick. So let's look at the characteristics of it. You have bounce 1 here, you have a bounce 2 here, and a bounce 3 here, just like you see in fractal 1 of the original structure. Bounce 1, bounce 2, bounce 3. Moving along, let's take a look at fractal 2 and examine the characteristics of it. So just like I was telling you in the original one, you have the two bounces, 1, 2. You have this crazy peak here. That's because HBAR is a sloppy chart. Let's go back to the original and compare this structure to that one. So here is the original structure, and you see the two bounces or two peaks right here. In the same way, we see that replicated here, or echoed. So let's move over to fractal 3. Okay, so here is fractal 3, and again, HBAR is true to its nature, and it's sloppy kind of iterations of these fractals. So the essence of it, though, is it moves up, comes to a peak, drops, and goes sideways before moving into the next fractal. Let's compare this structure back to the original structure. Okay, so here is fractal 3. It moves up, comes to a peak, drops, goes sideways and flat before moving into fractal 4. Now, this one was much sloppier with all the peaks and the jaggedness of it, but the fundamental idea of it moving up, it dropping, and going sideways is echoed once again. So now let's move over to fractal 4 and examine that one. Okay, so here is fractal 4, and as we can see, we have the two peaks or waves that take place. Let's compare this back to the original one. So here is fractal 4, and you have the two waves before moving into the bull run structure, just like we have here. So here is that bull run structure where in fractal 1, it consolidates before moving up to its peak. So we see this idea echoed In this sideways range-bound time, now it's unique, the way it played out, the timing, the height and depth made for a unique structure, albeit it is the same idea, the same theme playing out. So behind the timing, the height and depth, you have that basic fundamental structure at play. Okay, so here is the next time it plays out. So we have the ending of the bull run structure, which is fractal 5. Here's the decline. And here is fractal 1. So remember, fractal 1 is the bridge that goes from the bull run structure to the sideways range-bound time. It's the entrance into that sideways range-bound time. Now here it is not as clean as it was the very first time it played out, but you could see the basic idea of the bounces. So here's bounce 1. This one undulates. I would say this here is one bounce, and then you have the third one here. Let's compare that back to the original. So here's the original one with much cleaner, well-defined bounces. So I would say one of the themes of Fractal 1 is that in some renditions of it, it's just complete sloppiness, whereas in others, it's cleaner. You have the defined bounces like this original one. Moving forward, so it is my belief at least, that we have likely completed Fractal 1. We are now most likely starting Fractal 2. So if Fractal 2 is indeed playing out, this is what we should expect to see. Something, so this is back at the original, something similar to this, where we have two bounces or two peaks play out. So is this the beginning of the first bounce? I believe it very well could be. We'll have to see. Time will tell. Let's zoom out. Okay, folks, here is a zoomed out picture of the whole entire HBAR chart. If my thesis is correct, we have just completed Fractal 1 of the range-bound sideways time. We are now beginning Fractal 2. We still need to go through Fractal 3 and Fractal 4 before we get to the next bull run. Well, folks, that is it for my presentation. I hope you found value in this. If my thesis is correct, we still have some ways to go before we get to the bull run, but I do believe that it is a repetitive structure, and I believe that a bull run is likely to take place in the future. If you found value in this, you should hit that subscribe button, because I'm going to continue to follow this structure as it continues to develop. None of this information that I present here should be considered investment or financial advice. I'm not a financial advisor. If you did like this video, it'd be much appreciated if you hit that thumbs up button. So glad you caught this video. I hope you catch my next one. Have a great day, and bye for now.